ask. Yes. This webinar is the first webinar of two. The second webinar would be on the 6th of July from 3 p.m. We have divided things a bit, with the first webinar starting as a more political economy focused webinar to think of the humanitarian aid responses and to think of the longer durée of the crisis in Ukraine, not only focusing on the immediacy of war, but also on the European border crisis, on the crisis of social reproduction, and of the different temporalities of coloniality and decoloniality in Europe that we have had to face as Europe, as a continent, and as the continent where our association is based, the European Association of Social Anthropology. And the second webinar, which would also be sponsored by AAA's Society for the Anthropology of Europe and Soyuz and CF, will be about the Ukrainian megasites and heritage, and how heritage has been destroyed by war, and what we can do about this as anthropologists, or what we learn from these mass destructions. So the technical remarks, we are recording the first part of the webinar, and then we will be not recording during the Q&A, so that you can ask questions a bit more indiscriminately, and also so that the speakers can tell things that maybe they don't feel comfortable to have on the record, sorry. And then the video will probably be available after some time on Nomad IT's account for EASA. And on this note, I will give the floor to Prem Rajaram, who is going to be introducing the speakers and giving us some more details of the format of the event. Thanks, Prem, for agreeing to chair for us today.
Thank you, Maria. So as Maria said, my name is Prem Kumar Rajaram. I teach sociology and social anthropology at Central European University. Good afternoon to everyone. Good morning if you're not in this time zone, or good evening. It's a pleasure to be hosting this. I'm really happy EASA has organized it. So as you know, the title of this webinar is Humanitarian Responses to the 2022 Russian War in Ukraine. And I think that the idea really is to try to bring the recent well-established anthropological work on humanitarianism to shed light on issues to do with this current war and the current conjuncture around the war. Let me say a little bit about the procedure or the process. We will have 4 speakers. Each speaker will initially speak for 7 minutes, and then we'll open it up for discussions and Q&A. And it's my pleasure now to introduce the first speaker, who is Dr. Ella Dronchkiewicz, who is a graduate of Cambridge Anthropology, and she's currently a senior research fellow at the Institute for Sociology at the Slovak Academy of Sciences. She's the author of Institutional Dreams, The Art of Managing Foreign Aid, which is a book analyzing Polish humanitarian and development activities in Eastern Europe and in Africa. Ella builds on extensive fieldwork and also practical experience of working with NGOs in the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So I hand over to Ella.
Thank you very much for inviting me here today. So I wanted to give a little bit of historical perspective, to put more historical perspective of what is going on today in Poland because of the Russian invasion on Ukraine, the current invasion. So before February 2022, there was around 1.5 million of Ukrainians already in Poland, moving there because of the earlier crisis, but also for work, for studies, for life, right? Migrants. We know that as of last week, there were 3.8 million people who crossed the border from Ukraine. This is not to say who went for what reason, but from the beginning of the invasion, this is the number, 3.8 million. Daily, there is more or less now 22,000 people crossing the border in Poland, from Ukraine to Poland. And now there is, depending on the day, similar number going from Poland to Ukraine. There are very big difficulties with assessing the number of refugees in Poland, Ukrainian refugees from Ukraine in Poland as of now. It is estimated that this is between 1.5 million to 2 million of people who are now residing in Poland due to the conflict. The government doesn't offer official statistics, and this is based on the research done by NGOs and researchers in Poland. A lot of this is based on the GPS data from mobile phones and other estimates. So we have this image of Poland. A lot of what we see now is a situation which is the welcoming of refugees, and the management of the refugee crisis is dealt mostly by NGOs. It's a bottom-up movement. There is in Poland a lot of discussion about how welcoming and generous Polish society is, how much work is done by ordinary people. And there is, at some level, there is a big, maybe positive surprise. How did that happen? How did we arrive there? That there is such a huge support for migrants, for war refugees, especially vis-a-vis the situation on the Polish-Belarusian border, where people are not let in, the wall is built up, right? So the question is how we can understand that, how we can make sense of this selective compassion and what is going on. So in order to help a little bit with understanding this phenomena that is going on the Polish-Ukrainian border, I wanted to say a little bit more about the Polish history of humanitarianism and how important role Ukraine has been playing in that for the last 20 years. So part of my argument is that it is not new. This is actually a historical process. So historically, since the early 2000s, when there were institutions implemented built in the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs to manage official development assistance, all research, all data showed that Polish people are extremely sympathetic for humanitarian assistance. There's relatively low support for development aid, but huge support for any humanitarian cause. So this is in line with those longer trends. What is important is the most important moments in creating Polish aid industry was the siege of Sarajevo, where the first professional humanitarian organization was established as a response. That was Polish Humanitarian Action. And a second very meaningful moment for Polish humanitarian aid was were Chechen wars. And this is interesting because Polish humanitarian organization and other NGOs were not interested in going to Chechnya and providing humanitarian aid, but they realized they are flooded with aid and requests from citizens to support Chechnya. So it was in response to the bottom-up movement and request, let's go and support Chechnya in the war against Russia. So these are pivotal moments in the Polish history of humanitarianism. But Poland has a long track record of working with Ukraine through humanitarian and through development assistance institutions. Poland has been Polish actors, politicians, and NGOs were present in Ukraine during Orange Revolution, during Euromaidan. In Polish aid, Ukraine is a priority partner and has been since the inception of Polish official development assistance in 2004. Poland was the key actor who pushed for the establishment in the EU of the European Endowment for Democracy, together with Sweden. So Poland has a little bit different trajectory of support of providing foreign assistance. Unlike other key big EU donors, established donors, Poland was never interested in really supporting Africa. And there was quite some friction in the EU forum between Poland and other Eastern European countries and Germany, France, UK, who were pushing Poland and other new EU member states to provide aid to Africa. And Poland was very resistant to that. And the government said, no, our priority is Belarus and Ukraine. So, and they were so successful that they would create new institutions in the EU specifically to support Ukraine. So we can see now that we have almost 20 years of the history when Poland, through NGOs, because Poland is outsourcing its aid mostly through NGOs, but also through local governments, created a lot of partnerships and projects and smaller, bigger, longer durations, those which cost few thousand euros, those whose budget is few 100,000 euros. So we have this long history of cooperation. And I think what we see today is not a surprise that Polish citizens or NGOs are helping in Ukraine, but it is a result of 20 years of building networks, connections, friendships, relationships, quite meaningful relationships, long-term relationships through the NGOs and through the government. So when the conflict started, now people were ready and people had logistics and understanding and connections how to help each other. But most importantly, I think what is often very silenced in Poland or outside what I see is the importance of Ukrainians in Poland helping Ukrainians who are arriving in the country. So as I said, before the war, we had 1.5 million people in Poland, Ukrainians, and today they are extremely important and they are the ones who are navigating this humanitarian environment. What I wanted to say is that whenever there is a conflict, what is important is that the distant stranger is turned into familiar needy. So in Polish-Ukrainian relations, this step has been done through building relationships, but also through very specific crafting of a narrative that Poland has been mobilizing in order to generate support for its involvement in Ukraine. And part of this narrative is to emphasize some proximity between two nations, historical connections. There's some affinity of Slavic nations. Also, the important role is the common enemy, Russia, here. But also strong nationalistic feelings in Poland of a country which self-prescribes, and people in Poland who can see themselves as savers, people willing to sacrifice, fight for democracy, for their own and other people's freedoms. And a lot of what we see today is mobilizing this kind of discourse. And this support, and this is where I will go a little bit and finish towards the future, I think what concerns me is how much of current fantastic outpour of support is also mobilizing a lot of nationalistic discourses and is strengthening the nationalism in Poland and self-perception as somehow exceptional vis-a-vis the West, who is painted as not helping, not doing anything. And this is specifically played out by the government. And also as somehow unique leader in the Central Eastern European bloc. So I wonder if at some point this will not backfire and turn into sentiments against Ukrainian migrants, this boasting of nationalism. So I will finish here and we can talk later in the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Ella. We'll move straight on to Dr. Olena Fejuk, who is an expert on transnational labor migration, distant motherhood, and transnational youth. Her regional focus is on Ukraine and the wider EU Eastern Partnership relations. Her work has appeared in numerous academic journals. She has also directed 2 documentary films. Currently, she is a Marie Curie Fellow in a project Rights Lab towards transnational labor rights, temporary work agencies, and third country national workers in the EU at the University of Padua. So, Elena.
Thank you so much, Prem, for the introduction, and thank you so much for inviting me here. I think I would like to start by positioning myself. As Prem has mentioned, I have been working on labor migration mostly Ukrainian labor migration for quite a few years now. But I really felt quite at a loss, and I mean, I think I felt quite ethically and emotionally and morally kind of challenged by the situation of war and kind of, let's say, conducting research in this kind of a context. So my own personal contribution today is really just a number of observations which are based on some of the work that I just keep doing, continuing doing along the lines of my research. And also some of the observations that I saw through my engagement in various volunteering activities since February. So for this reason, I think there are three main points which I would like to highlight in connection to speaking to this current crisis of mobility and also to I mean, multiple crises, right, really linked to war and to setting this huge mobility in motion in the region. The first aspect that I would like to highlight is incredible fragmentation and diversity, not only of the experiences, but I would say of the life worlds that the war in Ukraine has triggered in this, I mean, among everybody, obviously. And here I would like to highlight a couple of things. First is just to remind us all about that mobility many times is a privilege, and not everybody can be on the move, and not everybody can afford to leave, and not everybody can afford to be mobile. So in terms of them who could leave Ukraine, who could be mobile, who could seek safety abroad, particularly abroad, this is an important aspect whenever we talk about you know, Ukrainian refugees. Let's say, let's use this word for the lack of better term. This fragmentation was very obvious in the first and the later days of the war. You know, when the first person I met here in Budapest, you know, she told me, first person who left Ukraine, and I met her in Budapest. She told me that she started the day by packing her salmon and avocado salad for her work into her bento box and jumping into her car and going to her workplace. And then all of a sudden she saw that half of the building was missing. And so she kind of turned around, got her kids in the car, and then she was there in Budapest a couple of days later, which is, of course, this experience is incredibly different from the experience of people whom I've been meeting just weeks later at the train station, you know, who witnessed their houses being completely destroyed, who lost their family members, who lost literally almost everything and could barely save their lives. I just want to emphasize again that while, of course, many humanitarian organizations and organizations that create want to provide effective help, there's a kind of a drive and strive in order to create an image, a recognizable image of a Ukrainian refugee, you know, someone whom when we scroll Instagram or Facebook, someone that we can immediately recognize, you know, and relate to. But I just wanted to emphasize that in my modest experience of volunteering here in Budapest, the diversity of people's situation and of trying to find the right response to their situation is incredibly difficult. And following up on what my colleague in the previous talk said, that this can cause a lot of resentment, and this can cause eventually with time, I mean, this can cause a lot of this kind of discussions about deservingness, undeservingness, and the split up, let's say, within communities. This also makes it incredibly difficult to conduct analytical research that can make kind of broader generalizations and kind of draw a broader picture about, let's say, labor market integration, or about the social integration of people, about adjustments, further plans, and things like this. The second point which I wanted to say, and I'll skip over it very quickly because my colleague before mentioned this, is that it is true that while Europe has created this unprecedented response of openness, opening the border and opening for mobility, basically I argue that it was the old networks of labor migration that were established in the last 30 years of extensive labor migration from Ukraine that has received the main economical, social, emotional burden of actually receiving these people and integrating these people. Just again, anecdotal notice that when I was volunteering at the train station in Budapest, very few people were arriving to Hungary. Everyone basically knew where they were going. Everybody was following some sort of loose networks, and we see this also in numbers of people how people go to different countries, that they kind of mirror the previous labor migration networks and numbers. And the final point, which I also want to highlight, which I think is very important, is that it is exactly at this junction when we see the role of the old networks formed mostly through labor migration, that we need to raise the point again of stopping to depoliticize labor migration, especially in terms of Ukrainian labor migration. In Ukrainian sociological kind of narrative, there is this view of 4 waves of migration, in which the 4th wave of migration, which started from 1991, is seen as apolitical. It is depoliticized and kind of always talked about as a purely economic mobility. And what we have seen also from in all the moments of crisis in Ukraine, Orange Revolution or Maidan, you know, these were the networks that took incredibly active political, economic, social play in the events in Ukraine, but also brought in shaping responses of European states to whatever was happening in Ukraine, and shaping the responses of the communities where they were working to whatever was happening to Ukraine. So I would finish here with this kind of call to look to introduce this broader political perspective onto the role of Ukrainian citizens abroad. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elena. We'll come back to these and to Ella's points towards the end with a quick Q&A. And I would like to turn now to Anna Balázs. So Dr. Anna Balázs received a PhD in social anthropology from the University of Manchester. Her doctoral research explored how residents in the East Ukrainian city of Mariupol re-evaluate infrastructural and symbolic legacies of the Soviet past after the start of the previous Donbass war. Dr. Balázs is currently working as a researcher at the University of Sheffield. Her research interests include temporalities of crises and transformation, deindustrialization, and the material afterlives of socialism. So, Anna.
Thank you, Prem. Can you hear me? Okay, so I will talk about the situation in Mariupol in particular, by focusing on how urban planning and now humanitarian practices are employed to realize combating state projects under the Ukrainian and now the current occupational regimes. And my focus is not on classic humanitarian work done by organizations, more on the way authorities try to approach the current humanitarian crisis in the city. And there will be a bit of a historical context. So I have done fieldwork in Mariupol between 2017 and 18, looking at, as you said, as Prem said, how locals re-evaluate their relationship to the symbolic and infrastructural legacies of the Soviet company town as a result of the geopolitical conflict. So in a similar way to what Andrew Sanchez describes, talking about the Tata Corporation in West Bengal, I found that the local implementation of neoliberal restructuring in post-independence Mariupol relied heavily upon discursive continuity with the past. Specifically, we are talking about discourses of corporate paternalism, which was a defining element in the classic Soviet company towns, But in Mariupol, some of the structural and discursive elements of this approach have been perpetuated by the subsequent regimes of factory management. So in the 90s, the main figure of this continuity is Vladimir Boyko, the director of Ilyich Steel, one of the two major steel plants in the city. So Boyko, often referred to as Red Director or People's Director by the locals, came from the Soviet management, and he made significant efforts to preserve workplaces and extended reforms of social protection for the workers over the most tumultuous years of the post-Soviet transformation. And this way, his work mitigated some of the most brutal consequences of the restructuring, but also importantly, it maintained local expectations about the relationship between employer and workers, or between authorities and citizens. So in the 2010s, the steel plants were acquired by Metinvest, a large international business conglomerate owned by Rinat Akhmetov, a Donetsk-born oligarch. And as part of Metinvest, most of the remaining forms of welfare provision had been gradually eliminated. The workforce was decimated and casualized, but corporate paternalism still did not disappear. In 2015, following the temporary occupation of the city by separatist forces, a new city administration coming from Metinvest managers was elected in Mariupol, and the new mayor, Vadim Boychenko, set out an ambitious plan for the medium-term development of the city. The main components of the plan were full reconstruction of the major public spaces and buildings, which were indeed in a bad shape and abandoned for the last 30 years, and also more general rebranding of Mariupol as a modern Ukrainian, European, etc. City that serves as a counterexample to the cities under separatist rule. So while this is a pronouncedly neoliberal urban development framework, which lacks most of the substantial economic measures of, let's say, a Soviet 5-year plan, in Mariupol, this was realized in a way that catered to the expectations of local population about being taken care of. And the main components of this adjustment were the return of the caring administration, the caring state, who has a vision for the city and its residents. And the other main component was the person of the mayor itself. So Boychenko consciously built on the legacy of Boyko, the Red Director, making sure he's personally overseeing the reconstruction processes, visiting public events, and in general showing up for the citizens. So this was, hopefully not too long, a historical context that shaped the local attitudes towards power and expectations about the state. And with this background, a key question that occurs in relation to the current occupation concerns the strategy of Russian authorities, which is how do they go about organizing life in the destroyed town, what kind of vision they offer to the population. And this question might seem cynical, but it needs to be discussed as it affects the everyday realities of more than 100,000 people who are still in the city. First, we see that they're building on long-established traditions of this taking care of citizens and maintaining order, sometimes in almost comical forms, like when the occupying forces started to do sanitary painting, which means repainting the pavement in the middle of the fully destroyed city. So through such practices, they intend to project a sense of normality, which is absurd enough in the given context, and position themselves as a source of support that the Ukrainian government had failed to provide for the locals, which is a false image, of course, based on practices such as distributing humanitarian aid by the Russians taken from Ukrainian and Red Cross and other volunteers. But it works in a context where people have been deprived of news and reliable information for the last 3 months. And this information is incredibly important anyway in shaping the horizon of possibilities for locals. For example, by spreading rumors about all Ukraine being occupied or Kiev being bombed by nuclear bombs. The occupiers create an information field where certain actions like escape Ukraine seem out of reach or impossible for the residents. And sorry, the other feature of occupation governments is that the support always comes with a heavy political price. There are news about water being distributed, but only together. Propaganda prints, humanitarian aid not given for free anymore for the working age population, only in exchange for cleanup work. And the compensation for the destroyed homes is offered by the Russians, but in exchange of a signed declaration that their house was bombed by the Ukrainian army. And finally, as expected, most of the support cannot be adequate in a context of complete infrastructural destruction. So medical facilities and professionals are missing, and this way medicines are sometimes distributed among the population without professional guidance, or some of the infrastructure is being slowly restored. We already hear the news, but it results in situations where water service is restarted in a network of broken pipes, and most of the water ends up on the streets in an already high-risk epidemiological environment. And all of this is taking place in a framework of intense propaganda and Russification, which also heavily determines the direction of the occupiers' future vision for the city. So, which leads me to my last mainly open-ended question of how the traumatized and vulnerable population perceives these measures. Of course, attitudes in a context of repression should be evaluated with extra care. But accounts of people who stayed show that residents already started to integrate this new constellation of power in their individual temporal horizons, focusing on deeply pragmatic aspects such as how and when to get compensation and how to switch to a ruble-based pension account. So this pragmatic attitude can be observed even among some of the people who have left and make their return dependent merely on practical factors like when they restore the electricity. But on the other hand, the majority who had left the city are unable to imagine any kind of future there under the current circumstances. So this exact proportion of political sympathies, level of agency, and practical considerations in these decisions is one of the areas I think where ethnographic work would be crucially important in the next period. And more generally, the daily life of these more than 100,000 people poses the question of how to maintain a sense of integrity in one's personal life trajectory, one's temporal horizon of imagining the future when the political and infrastructural basis of life are violently broken down. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. And now we have a final speaker, who is Dr. Celine Kanta, who works broadly on the politics and practices of migration and migration solidarity. She has had several research positions in Sciences Po and at the CEU. She has been the academic program manager for CEU's Open Learning Initiative, and she currently serves as academic advisor at the Paris School of International Affairs at Sciences Po. So, Celine.
Thank you very much, Prem, and thanks to the organizers for having me today. I'm very honored to be on such a panel. As Olena, perhaps I also want to start by saying it was really difficult for me to decide precisely what I could say in those 7 initial minutes. And finally, I decided to speak perhaps more as a refugee studies scholar, which is actually my official hat, and to try to share a set of broader and more historical, perhaps slightly more conceptual reflections from forced migration studies about the refugee as a figure, as a category, because I found those reflections helpful to think about what we may observe and witness today, including during fieldwork. And as Ella, I'm also interested in trying to give more historical depth to our reading, our analysis of the situation, and perhaps more generally to the relationship between states, citizens, and the refugee as a category, in order again to try to further contextualize our reflections on the parallels and the contrast between the current episodes of Ukrainian displacements and previous episodes of forced mobility, but also, and I believe Ella and Olena spoke very well to these points, of episodes of migration that would usually be categorized as non-forced or labor migration, and to try to go beyond this binary. I think this issue is especially important, perhaps because the point or the question of comparison has been quite central in the discussion around Ukrainian displacement. Comparison with the reception of other groups, with the situation at the Belarus border, as Ella said, comparison with the so-called migration crisis of 2015, but also comparison between the treatment of different groups displaced from Ukraine, mostly non-white, non-Ukrainian groups, who have not been received in the same way by states and institutions. And so this issue of selective engagement, I believe from what I've also seen in my very modest engagement through a very short trip to Hungary in March 2022, but also through my engagement here in France with different grassroots responses to the arrival of people displaced from Ukraine. So this selective engagement has been in many ways echoed in grassroots discourse, and there has been a tendency to present Ukrainian as more authentic refugees, more deserving of assistance than perhaps other groups. And the point I'm trying to speak to today is that first, obviously, this selectivity must not be seen as the expression of individual feelings regarding what victimhood looks like, but should rather be seen as connected to the very meticulous construction of an undeserving migrant, a fake refugee in both Hungarian and European political discourse, and the production of class-based, gendered, racialized, state-level official narratives of deservingness, which affect displaced people and how they are received, but also, in fact, affect different other social groups within states. And I believe those processes to be deeply connected to processes of state building, including at the meta level of the European Union. So in this sense, I believe there's really nothing new in the production of differentiated figures of displacement. Quite to the contrary, I'd like to argue in Europe, the refugee as a category has been historically shaped in ways that are congenial to furthering certain objectives and aims of states. And this, to an extent, determines the modalities according to which different groups are differentiatedly received, but also the way in which a single group might be, the reception of a single group might evolve over time and political circumstances. So I'm not saying that official framings of specific refugee groups fully overdetermine how different actors engage with them. And in fact, my own work has been precisely on identifying alternative and grassroots practices of reception and of support. But I believe that even more autonomous solidarity, self-led type of reception practice always exists in some form of relation, however tangential to those dominant state and aid frameworks. A very classic example from refugee studies would be the way the category of the refugee responds to state circumstances in the definition of the Geneva Convention, which is written and produced as a text with universal validity, protect people fleeing persecution, but which, many scholars have shown, in fact, reproduces a very specific figure of the refugee as a man fleeing the USSR in the context of the Cold War, in the aim of, joining the democratic capitalist West. And we've seen since how the very restrictive criteria outlined in the convention regarding the attribution of the refugee status constantly prove unable to provide adequate protection to people fleeing a range of situations. And first, of course, people fleeing economic violence, which is not coded at all as a motive for flight in official international laws around asylum. But going back even further into history of displacement, refugee studies scholars are not particularly good at this. And I think, in a way, historians are not always good at engaging with histories of mobilities and displacement. We see that episodes of exiles are always underpinned by states' demand for either hospitality or hostility to different groups. And in fact, we even see that states often accommodate in a selective manner, for instance, allowing people to integrate within labor market whilst encouraging discourses of exclusion. One of the examples that in forced migration studies we often use as the first sort of contemporary episode of asylum and of refuge is the exodus of 200,000 Huguenots, so French Protestants fleeing the French absolutist Catholic government in the 16th century, 50,000 of which went to England. It's seen as one of the first episodes of contemporary refuge because, of course, Huguenots were not the first to flee a territory due to violence, but they were chased away because of a state project and the sort of social-cultural processes of including and excluding different groups that come with it. And they were received in the name of a state project. And indeed, the emerging English state promoted openness to those refugees. They also come from very wealthy backgrounds for many of them, thanks to their involvement in the slave trade for some. And a very spectacular sort of a reception campaign was orchestrated. We see in historical sources that a lot was written about the proof to, how our reception of the Huguenot was proved to the attachment of the emerging English state to liberalism, to religious freedom. And this self-representation was very central to its opposition to the French absolutist state of the time. This brotherhood was also framed in terms of, religious proximity, which is also a discourse we hear today about Hungarian. But for me, it's key to understand that such categories of belongings are never static and they do not constitute essential features with immovable outcomes. And in fact, 50 years later, 50 years after the Huguenots, another group of Protestants, the Palatines, came to seek refuge in England from equally Protestant Germany, and they were received with great hostility. There was little strategic use in the spectacularization of their welcoming for the English state of the time. They were fleeing an allied state. They didn't bring any specific wealth. And they, in fact, were the target of a great hostility campaign and finally exiled to the colonies. So what I'm trying to say with this history is that histories of reception and rejection of exiles can help us to recognize the dynamic and contingent processes of racialization, of legitimization, of differentiation. And those are complex processes that evolve across time, that evolve across political circumstances. And those discursive construction of the refugee, the related calls to either welcome or reject them, always intersect both with the valuation regime and social hierarchies that structure host states, by which I mean the regimes of race, gender, class, and other configuration of social positions, including in the colonies or the colonial heritage of those, and with the specific circumstances of displacement, notably in terms of what we may call geopolitics or interstate relations, as also already been said. So I think I've finished my 7 minutes. I won't have time to go into more applied reflections, but thank you.
Thank you very much, Celine. And I think that the way Celine spoke and ended our discussion was really important in really bringing together a lot of the things that have been going on in Anna's and Olena's and Ella's talks, which is, I think, what we've tried to do, or what you have all tried to do, is to come up with historical and anthropological senses of the point that Olena made. Who is it who constitutes the appropriate figure of the migrant? Who is it who constitutes the appropriate figure of the Ukrainian migrant? And then this brings in all these racialized issues, these issues of who gets to belong, who doesn't get to belong, and as well, how this frames our joint or individual responses to the situation of war. And I think this is one of the values of anthropological work, anthropological/historical work, really taking things beyond the immediacy of a crisis and locating it in terms of a broader set of processes and histories. What we will do now is that we will open it up for Q&A in just a second, because I'd like to give the speakers maybe 1 minute to speak to what each other have said if they wish. But let me say, well, so we'll do that. And then with the Q&A, if you can, I'd strongly encourage you to, if you have a question, to use the raise hand function and to speak your question. If you prefer, you can write it in the chat and I will read them out. But maybe we can start by just giving Olena, Celine, Ella, and Anna a minute each if they wish to reflect on what any of the other speakers have said. Would any of you like to? No? Celine, please.
Okay. Sorry, just to get the conversation started. I guess what others said about, especially perhaps Ella and Olena, looking at more what's happening across borders, about the very civilian, let's say, nature of reception architectures. If we intersect this with this kind of moral economy and the very moralizing grounds on which people have been received in the name of, what you said, Prem, the figure of the good refugee or the good displaced person, I think we see again, and this has been mentioned, I think, by Ella, how precarious those reception regimes are and how susceptible they are to changing political circumstances or representations. So I think this is also something to be very attentive as scholars, but also as people who feel concerned by this situation more generally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yes, I can. Elena. I also wanted to add to this that I think it is very important to see the I would like basically to speak to what Ella and Anna was mentioning about the situational choices and practicalities. And I see also there's a question in the chat about the use of the term, right, about the temporary protection and about the refugee status. I think this is this is a really good place, like Prem said, for anthropologists and for ethnography to kind of kick in and to understand this kind of making sense of this incredibly, shocking circumstances the kind of how this will be played politically between people, how this will be played politically by the states, what Ella was mentioning. When can this discourses of patriotism and kind of brotherhood can be turned into discourses of against the people? What Anna was mentioning in terms of people in Mariupol, people who have to make everyday decisions about very practical survival choices. So I think it's a really fascinating moment to see how this kind of how these narratives can be played out, politicized in various aspects, in various contexts, and for different purposes. And I think for us as ethnographers and anthropologists, we can do a lot in order to kind of keep a clear, sober eye on these processes.
Okay, so thank you, Elena. Maybe we can open it up, and I see a question from Lale.